Right. Let's jump straight in. Today, we are meticulously breaking down the legal frameworks that govern marine pollution. We're going to move step by step from the coastline all the way out to the deep seabed. Because honestly, understanding exactly who holds the legal power to stop ocean pollution is the absolute only way we can actually protect our global waters. This explainer covers both the international and Indian legal frameworks for land-based and seabed marine pollution, and as you're going to see, geography literally dictates just how strict environmental law actually is. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our syllabus for today. We'll be moving from the shore out to the continental shelf, exploring the intro to pollution, land-based sources, India-specific land laws, seabed activities, offshore cases, and finally, a complete recap. Section 1. Introduction to Marine Pollution. Let's start by establishing the fundamental legal conflict at the heart of all this. It's what we call the paradox of proximity. It's a really fascinating legal twist. The closer the pollution is to human populations, think agricultural runoff, industrial sewage, or plastic washing down local rivers, the much larger the total volume of pollution. Actually, land-based sources account for the vast majority of marine pollution by volume. Yet, ironically, they are the least comprehensively regulated category in all of international law. Why? Well, because these activities occur entirely within a country's own borders. And nations are a lot like stubbornly private neighbors. They heavily resist binding international laws telling them what they can or can't do inside their own sovereign territory. Section 2. Land-based sources and UN Clause Article 207. So how does the world attempt to regulate this massive volume of pollution when it starts on dry land? Before we look at the exact law, let's ground this in a concrete example. In plain language, I want you to imagine a large industrial state discharging untreated effluent, like heavy chemical waste, right into a local river. That river flows downstream and eventually spills out into the ocean. This is your classic, textbook, land-based source of marine pollution. Applying our legal rule to that river example, the governing law is UN Clause Article 207. UN Clause stands for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, Article 207 requires states to adopt domestic laws to prevent pollution, but, and this is a massive but, it merely asks that they take into account internationally agreed rules and standards. So to restate the rules so we completely lock it in, for a land-based source like our industrial river discharge, Article 207 deliberately creates no binding global standard. It simply obliges states to legislate domestically while sort of keeping international rules in mind. It is a deliberately soft legal framework. This table brilliantly illustrates how the world manages that soft law. Globally, we have the Global Program of Action, or GPA, established in 1995. It's administered by the UN Environment Program, but here's the catch. It is strictly voluntary. It relies entirely on national action plans with zero binding force. But on a regional level, we have actual treaties like the Barcelona Convention for the Mediterranean or OSBAR for the Northeast Atlantic. When you put them side by side, the regional treaties are actually successful. And the reason is simple. Neighboring states sharing the exact same immediate body of water have a huge direct incentive to cooperate and protect it through binding treaty-based rules. Section 3. India's land-based legal framework. Because international law defers so heavily to domestic enforcement for land-based pollution, we really need to look at how a specific state handles this in practice. India fills this international gap using its own domestic laws. The heavy hitter here is the Water Act of 1974, which is enforced strictly by the Central and State Pollution Control Boards. India also uses Coastal Regulations Zone, or CRZ, notifications to stop industrial waste from being dumped directly onto beaches and sensitive coastal zones. And all of this operates under one massive legal umbrella, which is the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Section 4. Seabed Activities in UN Clause Article 208. Okay, let's completely shift our legal focus. We're moving off the coast and out into the ocean to look at activities happening on the seabed itself, specifically within a state's national jurisdiction, like its exclusive economic zone. Here is our concrete example for this environment. Imagine an offshore oil rig actively drilling on a nation's continental shelf. Suddenly, there's a catastrophic blowout and oil starts pouring directly into the sea. This is a seabed activity source of pollution. It is legally distinct from the land runoff we were just talking about. The governing rule for this scenario is UN Clause Article 208. This article requires coastal states to adopt laws controlling pollution from seabed activities, like installations, structures, or artificial islands. But listen closely to this key legal phrasing. These domestic laws must be no less effective than international rules and standards. Let's restate that rule. If an offshore rig blows out, Article 208 mandates that the coastal states' regulations absolutely must meet the international baseline at a bare minimum. And just as a quick aside for context, Article 209 handles the parallel question for the deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction, which is known as the area, and that's managed by the International Seabed Authority. Now, let's put these two standards side by side, because this comparison is absolutely crucial for your understanding. Notice this critical legal distinction. As we move geographically from the land to the seabed, the legal phrasing dramatically shifts. UN close Article 207 for land-based pollution only asks states to take into account international rules. That's a very weak standard that defers completely to territorial sovereignty. But UN close Article 208 for seabed activities uses mandatory, strict language. Domestic laws must be no less effective than international rules. The takeaway here: the farther we go out to sea, the stricter the international mandate becomes. Section 5. Deepwater Horizon and Offshore Rules. To truly understand what that strict, no less effective standard looks like in reality, we have to study the defining global case studies for offshore safety. Let's look at the facts of the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. This was a BP-operated well blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. It tragically resulted in 11 deaths and a staggering 4.9 million barrels of oil spilled over 87 days. The central legal and technical issue was the catastrophic failure of well control mechanisms, specifically inadequate blowout preventers. The impact? It fundamentally reshaped global offshore safety regulations. Why this matters for our lesson is that Deepwater Horizon became the absolute baseline benchmark. When Article 208 demands standards be no less effective, this event defined the strict standard that every international regulator now measures against, way beyond just U.S. waters. Now, just a year prior to Deepwater Horizon, we had another critical event, the 2009 Montara spill. The facts here: it was an offshore well blowout in the Timor Sea off the coast of Australia. The issue, very much like our previous case, was the total failure of well control barriers. The impact triggered massive environmental damage across the region and sparked an aggressive regulatory overhaul. Why it matters is that it serves as a second essential case study. It really underscores the global necessity for strict seabed regulations, and it acts as a vital, geographically closer example for nations in the Indo-Pacific region who are enforcing Article 208. Tying this all back to Indian domestic law, how does India meet that strict international benchmark for its seabed activities? Well, India's offshore oil and gas operations, like those massive ones in the Bombay High Field, are heavily regulated. You don't need to memorize every single acronym here, but just know that licensing goes through the Directorate General of Hydrocarbons, and highly strict safety standards are set by the Oil Industry Safety Directorate. But crucially, look at that final point. Environmental compliance runs right back through that same umbrella Environment Protection Act of 1986 that we saw for the land-based framework. So the legal umbrella is exactly the same, but the technical safety standards get incredibly strict to prevent offshore disasters. Section 6. Complete Lesson Recap. Let's formally lock in the doctrines and cases we've covered today in the exact order we learned them. This is your complete study guide. We started on land, where pollution is governed by the extremely weak taking into account standard of UNCLOS 207. We learned that for those land-based sources, binding regional seas treaties like Barcelona or OSPAR are vastly more effective than the totally voluntary global GPA of 1995. In India, this land framework relies heavily on the Water Act of 1974 and the EPA of 1986. Then we moved out to the ocean. Seabed pollution is governed by the strict, no less effective standard of UNCLOS 208. And finally, that strict standard is defined and cemented by the catastrophic failures of the Deepwater Horizon in 2010 and the Montara spill in 2009. Those cases serve as the ultimate safety benchmarks worldwide. As you review these notes, I want you to ask yourself a final question. We started today by learning the paradox of proximity, right? The largest volume of marine pollution comes from the land. So, if the vast majority of marine pollution originates from land, can our oceans ever truly be protected as long as states prioritize their own territorial sovereignty over binding global standards for land-based runoff? I mean, is comprehensive legal protection of our oceans actually possible under the current framework? It's a fascinating and, quite frankly, a vital question to consider as you continue your legal studies. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.